Compsognathus. Whew, it's a big name for little guys.
Yeah, they swarm you.
The Last of Us Part 2 takes a lot of risks, the most dangerous one being the decision to include this line from Joel.
See, there's a sequel. Wasn't as good.
This dialogue refers to Jurassic Park, a series that focuses on how characters with conflicting personalities learn to work together in a world with death around every corner. It's not about the dinosaurs, it's about the humans. At least, it used to be, but that's a topic for another day. The world of The Last of Us is similar in this regard. Yes, it takes place in a zombie apocalypse, but the zombies are at the bottom of the list of narrative importance. It's not about the infected, it's about how the characters of the game react to the world around them. I'm sure at least a few people on the development team saw the risk in including this line, knowing that it would be posted far and wide across the internet as a way of mocking Part 2 if it didn't live up to the acclaim of the original. It speaks to how confident the developers were in the game, showing how it wouldn't just meet expectations set by the previous game, but exceed them in many ways. Both The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2 start off very similarly. You begin briefly playing as a character that soon meets a painful, unfair demise. It's this character's death that serves as the primary motivation for the protagonist for the remainder of each respective game. Joel takes Ellie across the country as some sort of redemption for the death of his daughter Sarah. Ellie sets off on a quest for revenge against those that killed Joel. If and when The Last of Us Part 3 eventually releases, don't get too attached to the character you immediately begin playing as. I can just about guarantee you they'll meet a similar fate. Part 2's decision to quickly kill off Joel, the protagonist of the previous game and its most beloved character, has proven itself to be one of the most controversial narrative choices in recent memory. But that doesn't make it the wrong decision. In fact, thematically, Joel's abrupt, heart-wrenching death fits perfectly in with the world of the game. The universe of The Last of Us is cruel, merciless, and unforgiving. Playing the game at times can feel like you're struggling to keep your head above the water, and as soon as you come up for breath, something else shoves you back down. It's not just the fact that basically every NPC you meet tries to kill you. In an effort to remind you of just how harsh the world can be, the developers have scattered notes from many different characters across the landscape of your journey. You'll hardly ever meet any of these characters, but their stories can be thought of as vignettes, pieces of a collage that together paint the picture of what the world of The Last of Us can be to the less fortunate. In the context of the game, it wouldn't make sense for you to meet many NPCs to learn these things about them. This is the zombie apocalypse after all, not Persona 5. So, leaving these notes strewn about is the best way to leave you with echoes of stories that have already passed. It makes sense narratively as well. With most of the world's electricity and public services down, it's not like the characters are able to send a text or a letter, so leaving these notes for each other fits in best. At first, some of the stories are so dismal that they seem to border on grief porn. It's like the developers want their players to be constantly reminded how depressing the world that they've created is. But before you go as far as to say it's sad just to be sad, think about the world we're living in. You could open up your phone right now and find dozens of news stories more dejecting than anything in The Last of Us. Yes, their world is worse than ours in many ways, but not all. How The Last of Us Part 2 can take settings you're familiar with and twist them to partially destroy combat arenas is one of the game's biggest strengths. Everyone's familiar with what a school, aquarium, or hospital looks like, and so to see these areas repurposed so well is consistently impressive. There's parts where the game ventures a bit too far into the territory of scattering random waist-high objects around for your character to crouch behind, but for the most part, it's all integrated with the world. Designing a level that has an interesting layout, looks good, and makes sense contextually is no easy feat, and the title hits these marks very well. The Last of Us Part 2 takes place in 2038, but the world has remained frozen since the outbreak began in 2013. Thankfully, the game doesn't fall into the trap of littering itself with dated pop culture references to things like Sharknado and Flappy Bird, but the way it's set up does lend itself to some difficult to answer questions. Seeing as the game takes place 25 years after the zombie apocalypse started, the majority of the characters you play as and encounter have lived their entire lives in the post-outbreak society. Writing characters that have zero experience in a world close to ours seems like a nearly impossible task, and Part 2's execution here is a bit mixed. Having to write a game that spans over 20 hours, it could be easy to slip up and have a character mention something that they shouldn't have any knowledge of. Yes, they have access to movies and books that could give them a glimpse glimpse into what that world used to be like, but there's no way that would give the characters insight into society's many nuances. This is especially true given how hard things like working electricity are to come by, and watching 30-year-old movies takes far lower priority than outright survival. The writing team's method of avoiding the problem of characters talking about things they shouldn't know about is to just avoid this accessory dialogue entirely. The people you play as and interact with speak about very little other than their immediate goals. I'd be lying if I said the solution didn't work, and it does have the added benefit of meaning there's very little filler, but this does mean that there's shockingly little characterization, especially in a game that relies so heavily on its characters, and the player wanting to see them succeed. One of the most memorable moments from the first Last of Us was the discussion about an ice cream truck, where Ellie can't believe they really existed based on Joel's description.
That's true. This thing would drive around and play real loud, creepy music, and kids would come running out to buy ice cream.
You're totally fucking with me.
I'm serious.
Man, you lived in a strange time.
Told you so.
It's little moments like this that Part 2 could have used more of. I'm all for cutting the fat out of a script, but a little fat tastes good and can add quite a bit to the overall experience. When a writer intentionally writes themselves into a corner, it's always interesting to see how they get out of it. Sadly, The Last of Us Part 2 tackles this problem in the least interesting way possible by just avoiding it entirely. There's so many questions the world the game creates that just go unanswered. After 25 years, wouldn't you have run out of gasoline and bullets and batteries by now? Is there anywhere in the world that resembles what life was like before? How do you even begin to explain to a child that the world was an entirely different place a few years before they were born? Given how short lifespans are in the post-apocalypse, it won't be long until there's no one left who was alive pre-outbreak. And then how do you rebuild society when you have no idea what society was like? Not answering these questions means that Part 2 technically isn't giving any wrong answers, but that's not a very satisfying outcome. Overall, I'd say the writing of the game meets the needs of what the narrative creates, but it doesn't go beyond that. The closest The Last of Us Part 2 gets into this territory is the Seraphites, a society that actively rejects any technology or culture derived from the old world, as they call it. It's a group that heavily contrasts with all others in the game. Any other faction, either friendly or an enemy, is focused on recreating what the world was like before the outbreak. The Seraphites are the only ones working to create an entirely new society, free from any of the norms of the world prior to the first game. It's a flawed society, definitely, but it introduced concepts I wish the game had explored more. It's a shame that you only really get introduced to it about 3/4 of the way through the game, and even then you only get surface level explanations. It's a group like the Seraphites I'd like to see get more attention in an eventual sequel. The first Last of Us focuses entirely on Joel and Ellie. It's this special attention that builds up the importance of their relationship to the player. Because of the foundation this game built, it allows the second one to use Joel's death as Ellie's primary motivation. In this way, The Last of Us Part 2 is literally a Part 2 to the first game's story. The second title simply wouldn't work without the first. Instead of keeping the focus on one pair of characters, the second game opts to cycle through the individuals you'll be with on your journey, both playable and non-playable. It's a nice way of adding variety to the game, but the more brief interactions means that these characters' relationships can't meet the depth that Joel and Ellie's did. The game does eventually get back to the child and adult format of the previous one, when Abby forms an unlikely partnership with two Seraphite kids, Lev and Yara, starting from when the game briefly turns into God of War. It's here that we get to see Abby's character arc really get moving. Up until this point, she's just about as anti-Seraphite as they come, but through working together, she learns that her people are no better. It's a growth that's born out of vulnerability. Up until that point, Abby is a force to be reckoned with. She's not only physically imposing, but also extremely dead set and focused on her goals. Her conflict with Ellie really is when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. The best villains are the ones you can sympathize with, and acknowledge that if you were in their shoes, you'd probably do the same thing. Abby adheres to this mentality perfectly. Her motivation for killing Joel is clear and totally understandable. He killed her father and doomed the world by taking away the one chance for a cure to the virus. If that's not a good reason to go after him for revenge, I don't know what is. The world of The Last of Us isn't black and white, and neither is Abby. When you start playing as her in the latter portion of the game, you probably won't be very fond of her. but at least in my experience, she grew on me immensely as her story unfolded. The developers aren't shy about having her mirror Ellie in a lot of ways. Abby collects coins while Ellie collects trading cards, and they both have relationships with other characters that can be at times friendly but otherwise tense. Abby's fear of heights is incredibly similar to Ellie's inability to swim in the first game. It's these weaknesses that reach their full narrative potential in each game, when Ellie jumps into a river to avoid getting killed, and when Abby crosses some incredibly high bridges with Lev. It's moments like these that show how Ellie and Abby are probably more alike than they are different. The most surprising thing about The Last of Us Part 2 was how much I ended up liking Abby by the end, even more than Ellie. She starts off as a full-blown villain, but through her suffering learns to be a better person. The Abby that kills Joel and the Abby in Santa Barbara are entirely different, but the transition is so natural you almost don't realize it's happening. By the conclusion, I'm rooting for her and Lev, and I wouldn't be opposed to seeing a third game with them as the two main characters. This is a major contrast to Ellie, who the writers seem to want to make more and more unlikable as the game goes on. She's rude and dismissive to basically everyone that tries to help her, and causes way more collateral damage than Abby did in her pursuit of Joel. I don't think I've ever disagreed with a main character's decision more than when Ellie decided to leave her girlfriend and baby to go after Abby once again. Like, you made it alive out of an impossible situation. Why are you doing this again? But just because a character is making a wrong decision doesn't mean that's bad writing. Maybe those behind the story of The Last of Us Part 2 wanted to sour us on Ellie, and they definitely do a good job of it. Ellie's actions in the final battle also paint her in an awful light. She threatens to kill Lev, telling Abby that she made him a part of this, when clearly the only one bringing him into it is Ellie. Abby doesn't want to fight, but Ellie forces her, blatantly shifting Ellie into the villain role. However, Ellie's final decision to not kill Abby does come off as clumsy writing. It's not because of her final decision, but of how it comes about. From threatening to kill an innocent kid to letting Abby live just 2 minutes later, it feels like they were trying to cram the full arc that Abby went through in her story into Ellie in just one scene. I don't disagree with Ellie's decision to not kill Abby, but such an abrupt change of heart is jarring. Just like how I wasn't really expecting to like Abby, I wasn't expecting to enjoy The Last of Us Part 2 as much as I did. I'm someone who generally prefers gameplay-focused games, instead of cinematic experiences, which are often better made for movies or TV. Gameplay-wise, The Last of Us Part 2 is a pretty basic stealth game, with some overly forgiving checkpoints which discourage planning ahead. It's fine, but nothing amazing, and doesn't offer enough variety to justify how long the playtime is. But it's clear that gameplay wasn't the main focus of the developers behind Part 2. The story was. It's important to judge games based on what the designers were aspiring to create, rather than any preconceived notion of what a game should be. I find it impressive how the writers were able to make me like Abby more than Ellie, especially after seeing her kill Joel at the beginning of the game. Making me dislike Ellie in order to achieve that was a big risk, but one I think that was worth it in order to tell an interesting, unexpected story. The Last of Us is technically a zombie apocalypse franchise, but the real conflict is between the human characters. The first game established this, and the second expanded on it. It's earned its place in the series. While no one wants to see their favorite character killed off by someone they hardly know anything about, sometimes that's what's needed in order to keep a story going and prevent it from becoming stagnant or repetitive. Abby might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it's her actions that move the narrative forward and make the franchise much more than what it started as. But at the very least, hopefully her arc can stop players from saying,
That's a big mound of shit.